The road was quiet. Not quiet the way danger is quiet, the way Charlotte gets at that hour, when the people coming home from work have already come home and the people going out for the evening haven't left yet, and the space between those two groups belongs to the dark and the crickets and the smell of wet earth still rising after an afternoon rain. DeShawn Williams had walked home this way for 9 years. 7:18 in the evening. Every day, without exception, he knew every crack in the sidewalk. He knew which oak branch hung low enough to catch a taller man across the shoulder. He knew the sound the drainage ditch made after a heavy rain, the sound of dry leaves scraping against the road, the way traffic noise from the main boulevard faded out by the time it reached this block, grew thin, then disappeared, the way conversations do when the people having them run out of things to say. He knew this road better than he knew most people, and so he saw the shape before he understood what it was. Off to the right, just past the edge of the last street lamp, before the long dark stretch toward Tuckasegee, something lay against the ground near the drainage ditch. The wrong shape for a trash bag, the wrong color for dirt, too still for an animal. He stopped. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment, looking. Then he stepped off the curb, across the gravel shoulder, and moved toward it. A child. Small. 8 years old, maybe. Face down, left cheek pressed into the wet ground, one arm folded underneath her body, the other stretched forward, and in that hand, pressed against her chest, was a small stuffed bear, brown. Worn through at the seams. One ear had partly come unstitched, the batting inside gone soft and flat from years of being held. The left button eye was cloudier than the right. He knelt down. She was breathing. He could hear it slow and uneven, but there. A bruise was forming above her left temple, already dark against her skin. Her right forearm had a long scrape, dried now to a dark line from the wrist to the elbow. Her left shoe was missing. Her right sock had a hole near the big toe. He pulled out his phone. 15% battery. He pressed 911 and held it to his ear, and while the line rang he kept his other hand near her shoulder, not touching, just near the way you cup your hand around a candle flame in the wind. He gave the address. He described what he saw. He stayed on the line until the dispatcher told him the ambulance was on its way and asked if he wanted to stay connected. He said yes. He stayed on until he heard the sirens. Then he ended the call, took off his jacket, and laid it over her, not over the bear, around it. As if the bear was already doing its job and didn't need to be covered. The ambulance arrived 11 minutes later. He stayed the whole time. Stay with this story. What happens next is the part I haven't been able to stop thinking about. His name was DeShawn Williams. He was 75 years old. He had lived in the same house on Crestdale Avenue for 31 years, longer than some of his neighbors had been alive. Longer than the oak tree in the backyard that his wife Loretta had planted herself in 1994, when it was still a sapling barely reaching her shoulder. It touched the second-floor window now. He hadn't measured it since she died. Some things you stop measuring. Loretta Williams had passed 5 years ago. March, early in the morning, before either of them had made coffee. Heart failure. Fast. The doctors said that was a mercy. DeShawn had spent some time arguing with what doctors called a mercy and eventually stopped, not because he'd come to agree, because the arguing changed nothing and Loretta was gone either way. He still made coffee the way she taught him. 2 scoops of grounds, 1 extra, 2 sugars, no milk. Every morning, in the same drip machine they'd bought at a department store in 2001 when the old one finally gave out. He poured it into one of the 2 mugs they'd bought at a gas station in Tennessee in 2003, on the drive back from a trip they'd taken for their 40th anniversary, a long weekend in the Smoky Mountains, because that was what Loretta had wanted, and what Loretta wanted was generally what happened. He used the green mug. Hers was yellow. It sat in the cabinet behind the others, clean, in the same spot it had been since the morning she died. He had retired from electrical work at 68 after 40 years residential mostly, some light commercial in his later years when his knees were still reliable. He'd been good at it. Not spectacular, not the kind of electrician who redesigns a system while he's fixing it, but the careful kind, the kind who reads a diagram twice and measures before he cuts and checks his work before he leaves. His hands still knew the work. He kept his tools in a rolling cabinet in the garage, organized by size, every socket in its slot. The tools were clean. He maintained them the way he'd maintained his truck and his work boots and his relationships, not dramatically, just consistently, so that when you needed them they were there. 6 mornings a week he went to New Jerusalem Baptist Church as caretaker. He swept the front walk and checked the lights and unlocked the side door for whoever came early to pray, which was usually Sister Pauline and occasionally Brother Theodore, who had trouble sleeping and found that the church was quieter than his house at 5 in the morning. DeShawn didn't ask him about his sleep. He just left the lights on in the sanctuary and started on the back walk. He was always the first one there. He was home by 7 every evening. His Social Security check was $112 a week. He had paid off the house years before Loretta died, during a stretch in the late 90s when work was steady, and they had made a decision together to throw everything extra at the mortgage instead of taking the vacation to Savannah they'd been talking about. They never did get to Savannah. That was on the list. Along with the Grand Canyon and 2 weeks in New Orleans during Jazz Fest and a drive up the California coast that Loretta had described in enough detail over the years that DeShawn felt he had almost been there. The list was still on the refrigerator, held by a lighthouse magnet from a trip they had taken to Maine in 2008, the only time either of them had ever been that far north, and Loretta had stood at the edge of the Atlantic in a yellow windbreaker and said that the water looked like it went on forever, and DeShawn had said it did go on forever, and she had said she knew that. She just hadn't expected it to look like it. He hadn't taken the list down. There are things you stop doing and things you just keep not doing. Those aren't the same. His father, Elmore Williams, had been a bricklayer in Alabama for 30 years. He was the kind of man who woke up before his alarm and went to work in weather that kept other men home, and never once complained about either of those things, because he didn't consider them worth complaining about. He believed in doing the job in front of you, and he had passed that belief to DeShawn, not through speeches but through years of watching him do exactly that, in every situation, without exception. One night when DeShawn was 9 years old, the two of them were driving back from his uncle's house on a road outside Huntsville. No streetlights. The kind of country dark that has weight to it, that pushes back against headlights, and makes everything beyond the reach of the beams feel genuinely far away. There was a car pulled over on the shoulder. A white man stood beside it, hat in his hand, looking down at the tire. In 1962 in Alabama, on a road with no lights and no other cars, Elmore Williams pulled over. DeShawn watched his father get out of the car without a word, walk around to the trunk, take out the jack and the spare. The other man said something. Elmore answered. They worked together in the headlights for 20 minutes, in a silence that was more collaborative than most conversations DeShawn had heard. When they were done, the man tried to press money into Elmore's hand. Elmore shook his head once, put his tools away, and got back in the car. They drove the rest of the way home in silence. DeShawn never asked his father about it. He understood, in the way that 9-year-olds understand things that adults explain imperfectly, that asking would have meant he hadn't been paying attention. He had been paying attention. He had watched his father do the thing that was in front of him to do, on a dark road, for a stranger, with no one watching and nothing to gain, and he had understood that this was what his father considered to be a reasonable way to move through the world. 56 years later, on a wet road in Charlotte at 7:18 in the evening, he knelt down beside a child he had never seen before. He had been paying attention. At the hospital, the nurse at the desk was careful with her words. She said the girl had been admitted, that she was stable, that the county would be making some calls. She said it the way people say things when that isn't the whole story. And DeShawn had been alive long enough to know the difference between someone who didn't have more information and someone who did but wasn't sharing it yet. He asked if anyone was with her. There wasn't. He sat in the waiting area for 2 hours. He read a magazine he didn't care about. He watched the people who came in through the emergency entrance, and the people who left, and the nurses who moved between those two things, with the practiced efficiency of people who have learned to hold the weight of other people's emergencies without being crushed by them. At 10:15, a woman from the county arrived with a clipboard and a badge. She had the look of someone who had done this enough times to have developed a system for it. At 10:40 she came out and spoke with him. The girl's name was Ashley Carter, 8 years old, no emergency contacts on file, no parents reachable. The county was working on placement. DeShawn said, "She can come home with me." The woman looked at him. She asked several questions. She wrote several things down. She explained the process with the patience of someone who had explained it many times and understood that explaining it was part of the job. There were steps, there were background checks, there was paperwork. It wasn't simple, and it wasn't fast. He said he understood. He would do whatever the steps required. While he waited, while his phone charged in the outlet near the vending machines, and the paperwork moved through the system, and the county woman made calls on her cell phone in the corridor, one of the paramedics set the bear in the plastic tray with the girl's other belongings. A plastic bag with a change of clothes, a hair tie, one shoe. DeShawn looked at the bear for a moment. Then he picked it up. He hadn't meant to find anything. But his hands were a working man's hands, hands that had spent 40 years locating things by touch in walls and ceilings and panels where you couldn't always see what you were doing, and what they felt was a small, deliberate hardness near the bear's midsection. Not a seam, not a button, something placed there. He turned the bear over and looked at the back. The stitching along the center seam was newer than the rest of the bear, tighter thread, a slightly different color, laid in with more care than the original factory stitching. Someone had opened this bear and closed it again. Someone who knew how to use a needle. He worked a thumbnail carefully along the seam, just enough to understand what he was feeling. A piece of paper, folded small, gone soft from being in there for some time, the creases worn smooth. He drew it out slowly, opened it on his knee. He read it twice. Then he folded it back exactly as it had been. He walked to the nurse's station and asked if anyone had a needle and thread. A young nurse looked at him like this was an unusual request at 11 o'clock at night in a hospital waiting room, which it was, and then she went and found him what he needed because he had asked quietly and explained that the bear had come apart and the child would want it back in one piece. He sat back down in the waiting room chair and sewed the seam closed. He worked slowly. He kept the stitches even and tight and went back through the same holes the old thread had used, so that when he finished the seam looked the way it had looked before, or close enough, maybe slightly neater. The thread was a slightly different color. He couldn't do anything about that. He set the bear back in the tray. He never told anyone what the note said, but the name written on that paper, written in careful handwriting, the kind of careful that comes from wanting to be understood, he filed in the part of his memory where he kept things he would need later. The way an electrician marks a breaker before he goes to find the fault. Renee Holloway. Ashley Carter arrived at Crestdale Avenue 11 days later. She came with a social worker named Mrs. Elaine Patton, who was a compact, efficient woman in her mid-40s, who had been doing this job for 16 years and had developed, over that time, a manner that was simultaneously warm and precise, the way a good instrument is both reliable and well-calibrated. She spoke to Ashley on the drive over and continued speaking to her in the front hallway of the house, while DeShawn stood back and let the introduction happen the way it needed to. Ashley stood in the hallway with a plastic bag in one hand and the bear in the other. The bag held everything the county had been able to collect for her: a change of clothes, a toothbrush, a small stuffed elephant with one missing eye that Ashley had not touched since she arrived at the hospital and did not touch now. She held the bear against her chest with her right arm, not tight, just present, the way you carry something you've stopped thinking about but aren't ready to put down. She looked at the house the way someone looks at a door they're not sure they're allowed to open. Mrs. Patton showed her the bedroom, the one across from DeShawn's, with the blue and white quilt that had belonged to Loretta's sister and the small window that looked out at the oak tree. Ashley walked in and stood in the center of the room and looked at the quilt. She set the plastic bag down on the floor. She walked to the bed and placed the bear on the pillow, taking a moment to settle it in the right position, which appeared to require some consideration. Then she turned and looked at DeShawn, who was standing in the doorway. He said, "This is your room. You can put your things wherever you want." She didn't answer right away. She looked at the bear one more time, then back at him. Then she said, "Thank you." Just those two words, said straight, without performance, the way you thank someone when what you've received is something you weren't sure was coming. He went downstairs and let her settle. He found out later by accident, because she had fallen asleep with the light on and he knocked before entering to turn it off, that she slept with one hand resting flat on the bear. Not hugging it the way small children hug stuffed animals. One hand lying on it, fingers slightly curled, the way you rest your hand on something you don't want to drift away in the night. He turned off the light and went back to bed. He lay there for a while, with the ceiling dark above him, and thought about a piece of paper folded inside a stuffed bear, and a name written in careful handwriting, and a child who slept with one hand, keeping track of something she didn't. No was there. He didn't sleep for a long time. Claudette Monroe knocked at 8 the following morning. She had lived across the street for 22 years, had been there when Loretta was alive, had brought food when Loretta died, had continued to wave from her porch in the mornings when DeShawn walked to his car, had never once made him feel that her presence in his life required anything from him in return. She was 68 years old and had raised 2 grandchildren, Destiny and Malik, after her daughter Tamara died of an aneurysm in 2009 at the age of 31. Destiny was now 22 and in nursing school in Raleigh. Malik was 19 and working construction. Claudette had not done this gracefully or easily. She had done it the way you do hard things, one day at a time, with a great deal of prayer and a moderate amount of coffee, and the occasional evening on her porch, where she sat alone and let herself feel how tired she actually was. She recognized immediately the way a can be canned, who had calibrated her presence to take, who was waiting to see what the rules were before she made any moves. She had seen that stillness in Destiny for the first 2 years after Tamara died. She came with a box of biscuits and a paper bag. "I've got clothes from my granddaughter," she said when DeShawn opened the door. "About the same size. Some of them nearly new. That child needs warmer things than what she came with." She handed both items to him without coming inside, without waiting to be thanked, and walked back across the street with the measured pace of a woman who has things to do and is not performing charity. Ashley opened the bag carefully, item by item, holding each piece of clothing up for a moment before placing it in one of 2 piles she was making on the kitchen table, keep and return, with the kind of efficiency that doesn't come from training. It comes from necessity. She kept 6 items. She returned the rest without comment. She didn't ask who the neighbor was. She asked, "Should I write a note?" DeShawn said it was up to her. She got a piece of paper from the counter and a pen from the kitchen drawer and wrote 8 words in handwriting that was careful and even, each letter fully formed. The kind of handwriting that comes from a child who has been told that how you write something says something about how much you care. She folded the note and put it in the bag with the returned items and set the bag near the front door without asking whether that was the right place for it. He saw the note later. She hadn't sealed it. "Thank you for the clothes. I will take care of them." He left the bag on the porch that afternoon. When he looked out the front window an hour later, it was gone. That evening, he cooked enough for 2 for the first time in 5 years, pork chops, rice, collard greens, and set the table with 2 plates and 2 glasses of water and didn't make a production of it. Ashley sat down when he called her, ate everything on her plate, said the greens were good, and asked if she could help wash the dishes. He said yes. She washed and he dried and they put things away in silence. And when they were done, she asked what time breakfast was in the morning, and he said 7:30, and she said okay and went upstairs. He stood at the sink for a moment after she was gone, looking out the window at the oak tree in the dark. Then he dried his hands and turned off the kitchen light. Marcus Williams called on Thursday afternoon, 3 days after Ashley arrived. They had a standing Thursday call that had started during the pandemic when Marcus was working from home and had time to talk in the afternoons and had continued afterward out of habit. They talked about the things men talk about when they are not yet talking about the thing they actually need to talk about: the game last Sunday, the weather this week, whether the roof on the church had held up through the last storm. DeShawn mentioned Ashley at the end, after the church roof question had been answered, and there was a natural pause in the conversation. Marcus said, "What do you mean, staying with you?" DeShawn explained. "The road, the ambulance, the county, the paperwork. The 11 days, the 11-day process that was now 11 days behind him, and that had resulted in a child sleeping in the room across the hall." Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Pop, you're 75 years old." DeShawn said, "I know how old I am. That's not what I mean, and you know it. I mean, have you thought about what this looks like in 6 months, in a year? I'm thinking about what it looks like right now. That's not the same thing." "No," DeShawn said. "It's not." Another pause. Longer this time. Marcus had his father's habit of going quiet when he was working something through a habit that Imani had, in the early years, mistaken for stonewalling, and later come to understand, was simply the way Williams men processed things. "You waited," the answer came. "Imani and I are coming Sunday," Marcus said. "We'll talk." "There's nothing to talk about yet. She's been here 3 days. "Then we'll talk about the 3 days," Marcus said, and ended the call. Marcus Williams and Imani Jackson had been together for 7 years. They had met at a conference in Atlanta in 2015. Marcus was there for a supply chain management session he hadn't wanted to attend, and Imani was presenting a paper on triage protocols in under-resourced outpatient settings, and they had ended up at the same table at the conference dinner and talked until the hotel bar closed. They had been good together from the beginning, the kind of couple that functions well under pressure because they have learned to divide tasks without negotiating every time, to read each other's stress levels without asking, to give space when space is needed, and take up space when that is what is needed instead. They had tried to have children for 5 years, 2 years of natural attempts, 1 round of intrauterine insemination that failed, 4 rounds of in vitro fertilization. The last round had failed 9 months before Ashley arrived at Crestdale Avenue. They had not discussed trying again. They had not discussed stopping. They had arrived, through a series of small retreats from the conversation, at a place where the conversation simply didn't happen, where the shape of it existed in the room between them, and they moved around it carefully, the way you move around furniture in the dark when you know where everything is but still don't want to run into it. They arrived Sunday at noon. DeShawn had made lunch, fried chicken, macaroni and cheese, to a salad that no one was going to eat much of, but that Loretta had always insisted on, because she said a meal without something green was not a real meal. Ashley had come downstairs at 11:30 and asked, without any particular emphasis, whether she could help with anything. DeShawn gave her the salad to make, which involved tearing lettuce and cutting cherry tomatoes in half and arranging things in a bowl, which she did, with the same careful attention she applied to everything. She had set the table by the time Marcus and Imani came through the door. Marcus looked at the table, then at Ashley. He was 44 years old and had his father's build, broad through the shoulders, careful in his movements, the kind of man who doesn't take up more space than he needs but whose presence is felt in a room regardless. He was not unkind. He was not cold. He was a man whose grief had taken a specific shape, had taught him to organize his life carefully around the space where something was missing, and Ashley's presence in the house pressed against that shape in ways he hadn't been prepared for. Imani Jackson was a registered nurse at a private outpatient clinic in Dilworth. She was 41 years old and had the particular quality of attention that good nurses develop over years of practice, the ability to see past what a person is presenting to what is actually happening, to notice the thing the patient isn't saying, to read the body language and the eye contact and the way someone holds their breath when a certain topic comes up. She had applied this skill to her patients for 15 years. She applied it now to Ashley, across the lunch table, without entirely meaning to. Ashley looked back once, then looked down at her plate. She ate neatly, complimented the macaroni and cheese in 2 words. This is good, and contributed nothing else to the conversation during the meal, though she listened to everything. She was the kind of child who listened to everything. She refilled her own water glass twice, from the pitcher on the table, and when she finished eating, she asked whether she should take her plate to the kitchen. DeShawn said yes. She took her plate and Claudette's empty casserole dish. Claudette had sent over a sweet potato pie that morning, and Ashley had noticed the dish sitting on the counter and carried them both to the kitchen in one careful trip. After she went upstairs, Marcus waited for the sound of her door. Then he said, "Pop, this isn't something you can do alone." "I'm not doing it alone. Mrs. Patton comes every 2 weeks. Claudette's across the street. Claudette Monroe is 68 years old. She raised 2 kids after her daughter died." "That's not the point." "Then what is the point, Marcus?" Marcus looked at his coffee, then at Imani. Imani was looking at her hands, which were folded on the table in front of her in the posture of a woman who has decided to let a conversation happen without her for the moment. He said, "She needs to be somewhere that's set up for this, a family that knows how to handle a child who's been through whatever she's been through. You're 75 years old, you live alone. If something happened to you..." "Something could happen to me at any time," DeShawn said. "That's been true for 20 years. This is different." "How is it different?" "Because she'd be here." DeShawn was quiet. Then he said, "The first night she was here, she slept the whole night. I checked. I listened. 5 years of living alone in that house, and I have learned every sound this building makes. And the only new sound I heard that first night was a child breathing evenly in the room across the hall." The table was quiet. Marcus looked at his coffee again. Imani looked at the window. Neither of them said anything. After a moment, Imani stood up and began clearing the table. She moved efficiently, stacking plates with the practiced ease of someone who has spent a lot of time in kitchens doing necessary things, and she carried them to the sink and ran the water and didn't say a word about any of it. Marcus watched her for a moment, then looked back at his father. "We'll talk again," Marcus said. "Soon." "Whenever you want," DeShawn said. They didn't resolve anything. This wasn't the kind of conversation that resolves. It was the kind that does its work slowly, over many weeks, through small adjustments and silences, and the gradual accumulation of evidence. Ashley had come partway down the stairs during the conversation. She hadn't meant to hear it. She had come back down for a glass of water, which she hadn't gotten before going upstairs, and had stopped on the 5th step from the bottom, when she caught enough of what was being said to understand what was being discussed. She sat down on the step. She listened until she heard the chairs move and Imani's footsteps toward the sink. Then she went back upstairs without the water. She sat on the edge of the bed with the bear in her lap and both palms flat against its sides, feeling the familiar give of the batting and the small firm place at the center that had always been there, that she had never thought about until this moment. She didn't cry. She was not, in general, a child who cried easily. She looked at the quilt on the bed, blue and white, a pattern of squares and triangles repeated across the whole surface, and counted the triangles the way she sometimes counted things, when she needed to give her mind something specific to do. She got to 64 before she heard the chairs move again downstairs and understood that the conversation was ending and the visit was winding down. She put the bear back on the pillow in its usual position and went to wash her face. The first months were quiet, in the way that the first months of a new arrangement are always quiet, not the quiet of peace, but the quiet of people figuring out where the edges are. Ashley went to Shamrock Gardens Elementary School, 7/10 of a mile from Crestdale Avenue. DeShawn walked her there in the mornings, and Claudette's cousin Jerome, who drove a school van for a living and whose route took him through the neighborhood in the afternoons, brought her home for $40 a month, which DeShawn absorbed by trimming the same amount from the grocery budget. He didn't tell her about this. She would have said it wasn't necessary. She did her homework at the kitchen table every afternoon without being asked. She stacked it neatly when she finished. She put her pencils back in the same drawer where she'd found them, and didn't leave things out on the counter. She learned DeShawn's routines the way water learns the shape of its container, not because she was told, but because she watched carefully and remembered what she saw. She knew the coffee went on first. She knew Tuesday and Thursday were trash days. She knew he watched the local news at 6 and the game on Sundays, and she learned to tell which sport by the way he sat in his chair forward, elbows on his knees for basketball, back and still for football. She asked questions carefully, one at a time, never more than one in a day. She asked once why the 2 other bedroom doors were kept closed. He said those rooms had belonged to other people. She didn't ask who. She asked once whether the oak tree in the backyard had always been that tall. He said no, it had been planted about 25 years ago, when it was barely a sapling. She nodded, and didn't ask anything else about it, though he noticed that she sometimes looked at it through the kitchen window when she was washing dishes. The way you look at something old, that has outlasted things, you expected to outlast it. She made one friend at school, a girl named Priya Mehta, who lived on the far side of the school zone, and who had an energy that was the opposite of Ashley's stillness in every possible way. Priya talked continuously, laughed easily, had opinions about everything, and seemed to find Ashley's quality of attention, the way she listened without interrupting, the way she remembered things days later, the way she asked follow-up questions about things Priya had mentioned in passing and thought she'd forgotten to be one of the more satisfying things about their friendship. They did homework together twice a week on video calls. DeShawn could hear Priya's voice coming down from upstairs during these sessions, a steady current of commentary and laughter, and occasionally, Ashley's laugh, rare, brief, and entirely genuine, the laugh of someone who doesn't laugh unless something is actually funny. He would be at the stove when he heard it, and would stop what he was doing for a moment before he remembered. She kept the bear on her pillow. She had restitched the Lucier herself in the first month, using the small sewing kit from his bathroom cabinet, and the stitches were crooked, but they held. One Saturday morning he saw her examining the back seam of the bear while she sat at the kitchen table eating breakfast. She wasn't picking at it, just looking at it, running her thumb along the line of stitching. She put it down when she noticed him watching and didn't do it again when he was in the room. One afternoon in October, she was at the kitchen table, working through a math problem that was giving her trouble: long division, which she had the process for but not yet the instinct, and DeShawn was at the stove making soup. Something moved outside the window. A bird landing in the oak tree, or a branch settling in the wind. They both turned to look at the same time. Caught each other looking. Both turned back. Neither of them said anything. She bent back over the worksheet. He turned back to the soup, but from that evening on, DeShawn started making enough for two people, instead of cooking exactly enough for one the way he had since Loretta died, because it was becoming clear that cooking exactly enough for one was no longer an accurate description of the situation. Meanwhile, in the evenings after Ashley had gone upstairs, and the house had settled into its nighttime sounds, DeShawn sat at the kitchen table with the old laptop Marcus had given him 3 years ago and began, slowly and without telling anyone, to look for Renee Holloway. He was not good with computers. He was of a generation that had learned what they needed to learn about technology and had stopped at the point where it became more trouble than it was worth, and the point where it became more trouble than it was worth had arrived for him sometime around 2012. But he had 40 years of experience tracking problems to their source, and he applied the same patience to this that he had applied to every junction box, and every tripped breaker, and every mysterious fault in a system that should have been working but wasn't. He started with the name alone. He got thousands of results and no useful information. He narrowed it by location: Charlotte, North Carolina. Better, but still too many. He tried combinations: the name, the county office, social services. He wasn't sure what he was looking for exactly. He was looking for the shape of a life, the same way you look for the shape of a fault in a circuit, not for the specific problem, but for the place where the current stops moving the way it should. It took him 3 months to find something solid, 6 months to confirm it. 9 months before he felt he understood enough to stop looking and start thinking about what he understood. Renee Holloway had worked for the county's Department of Social Services until 5 years before the night he found Ashley. She had left or been let go. The record was unclear and moved to Greensboro, 100 miles north of Charlotte, in the spring of that year. She was working at a laundromat on Elm Street in downtown Greensboro, a small family-owned place that had been there for 30 years. She lived alone in a one-bedroom apartment on the second floor of a building 2 blocks from the laundromat. He didn't find a photograph. He found enough. He sat with what he had found across several evenings. He sat with the fact that this woman had known about Ashley before Ashley arrived on his road. He sat with the fact that she had prepared, had written something down, had placed it where it would be found, had made a decision that was not the easiest decision available to her, and had carried it out carefully. He sat with the fact that a person who doesn't care doesn't do those things. A person who doesn't care walks away without looking back. He didn't know why she had done what she had done. He thought about the note. He had read it twice and remembered every word. He thought about it for a long time. Then he folded the information away and went on with his life. He had a child to raise and a church to open in the mornings and a city that was not finished demanding his attention, but he remembered. He filed it in the part of himself where he kept things he was not ready to act on, but was not willing to forget. Marcus and Imani came most Sundays through the fall and into the winter. The visits had a shape to them: lunch, a conversation that was mostly Marcus and DeShawn, talking about things that were not the main thing, while Imani listened and said precise, well-timed things, and then an hour or two in the living room before Marcus and Imani drove back to their apartment in Noda. Ashley was present at the lunches and absent from the living room conversations, which seemed to be an arrangement everyone had arrived at without discussing it. Imani watched Ashley. Not the way a person watches a problem, the way a person watches something they are trying to understand. She noticed that Ashley always took the smallest portion when the serving dish went around, even when there was plenty. She noticed that Ashley thanked DeShawn at every meal, not as a habit but as a deliberate act, said with eye contact and a brief pause that gave it weight. She noticed that when Marcus asked Ashley a direct question, Ashley answered it completely and accurately, and then stopped, didn't elaborate, didn't fill the silence, and waited to see whether more was wanted. On a Sunday in February, Imani arrived early and found Ashley on the back porch washing DeShawn's truck. It was a cold morning, 41 degrees, and Ashley had her jacket on and was working with a bucket of soapy water and a rag, section by section, methodically, her breath visible in the air. No one had asked her. DeShawn was inside making lunch. The truck was clean enough, he kept it clean, but Ashley was making it cleaner, going over the wheel wells with the corner of the rag and working along the side mirrors with careful attention to the trim. Imani stood at the screen door and watched for a minute. She didn't say anything to Marcus about it that day, but the following Sunday she brought a box of brownies from a bakery on West Boulevard, and she set them on the counter without announcing them. Ashley came into the kitchen and saw them. She looked at Imani. Imani said, "I figured you might like chocolate." Ashley said, "Thank you." Imani said, "You're welcome." That was the whole exchange. But it was a different kind of quiet than the quiet that had been in the kitchen before. Ashley cut a brownie into 4 equal pieces with the precision of someone who has learned that taking less than half is a safe approach to most situations, ate 1 piece, and wrapped the other 3 in a paper towel for later. The Sunday after that, Imani brought a bag of apples. The Sunday after that, a small bag of coffee for DeShawn. She wasn't ready to call what she was doing by its real name. She filed it under the category of things she was doing without examining too closely why she was doing them, which was a category she had learned to maintain and not interrogate. Marcus noticed. He didn't say anything about it. He was a Williams, and Williamses waited for the right time. A year passed, and most of another. Ashley settled into school, the way she settled into everything, with the kind of competence that doesn't announce itself but doesn't fail. She was thorough, not brilliant. She did the work and checked it and did it again if it wasn't right. She got better, steadily, at most things. Her 3rd grade teacher wrote on a progress report, "Ashley works carefully and takes pride in her assignments. She is a thoughtful member of our classroom." Her 4th grade teacher wrote, "Ashley is one of the most reliable students I have taught. She can be counted on." DeShawn kept both reports in the kitchen drawer, under the takeout menus, where he kept things he wanted to have but didn't need to display. She had grown 3 inches by the end of the 2nd year and needed new shoes, which she mentioned only when the old ones had begun to genuinely hurt her feet. DeShawn took her to the shoe store on a Saturday morning and she tried on 4 pairs and selected the 2nd cheapest option, which fit well and which she said would last. He bought her the 3rd pair she had tried on instead, which was $12 more and which fit better, and she accepted this without argument, but held the box carefully on the way home, as if she was aware that she was carrying something that had required a decision. Stay with this, what happens next is the part that stays with you. Ashley Carter turned 13 on a Thursday in April, 5 years after the night DeShawn found her on Enderley Park Road. She had become, by then, a person he recognized as fully as he had ever recognized anyone, her rhythms, her preferences, her specific silences. The way she moved through the house with an efficiency that was not urgency, but was also never aimless. She still kept the bear on her pillow. She still sat on the back porch, sometimes in the late afternoon, looking at the oak tree. She still laughed rarely and genuinely when something was actually funny, and the things she found funny tended toward the dry and the unexpected, which was the same things DeShawn had always found funny. The evening before her birthday, she sat on her bed with Claudette's sewing kit open beside her. The ear of the bear had come loose again, the same ear, the same seam, the same gradual failure of the same stitching she had repaired herself twice before. She took out a needle and thread. She had gotten good at this. The stitches were neater than her first attempt, not as neat as the ones she hadn't made. She found the end of the loose thread and began to work. Her fingers felt something. She stopped. The seam along the back of the bear had been there for as long as she could remember, and she had run her thumb along it more than once. Over the years had noticed that it was different from the other seams, newer looking, stitched with more deliberate care. She had not, until this moment, followed that observation to its logical conclusion. She set the needle down. She held the bear in both hands and looked at the back seam for a long time. Then she worked her thumbnail along it slowly, carefully, the way you open something you're not entirely sure you should be opening. There was something inside. She drew it out. A piece of paper, folded small, soft from years of sitting in the cavity of the bear's midsection, the creases worn smooth. She held it for a moment, without opening it. The refrigerator downstairs clicked on. The hum of it came up through the floor, the familiar nighttime frequency of the house settling into itself. She opened the paper. She read what was written on it. She read it again. She sat with it for a while. Not moving, not doing anything, just sitting on her bed in the quiet of the upstairs of the house on Crestdale Avenue with a piece of paper in her hands that she had not known existed until this moment, and that had been there, inside the one thing she had brought with her from before, for as long as she could remember. She folded it back exactly as it had been. She pressed it back inside the bear, into the same place. She picked up the needle and thread and sewed the seam closed even stitches, tight, through the same holes as before. When she was done, the seam looked the way it had looked before. She could see the difference between her stitches and the older ones if she looked closely. She didn't think anyone else would notice. She put the bear back on the pillow in its usual position. She went downstairs and asked DeShawn how long until dinner. He said 20 minutes. She said okay and went back upstairs. She did not say anything to him that evening or in the days that followed. She said nothing to anyone. But she had begun, from that night, to pay a different kind of attention. Her birthday the next morning, smothered chicken, rice, green beans, which was what she had asked for when DeShawn asked her 2 weeks before what she wanted for her birthday dinner. Claudette came over at 5 o'clock with a sweet potato pie and stayed for the meal. Imani brought a cake chocolate, 3 layers, Ashley's name written in yellow icing with a steadiness of hand that spoke to either practice or genuine care, possibly both. Marcus brought a book on the history of architecture, a thick, serious volume with photographs that Ashley had mentioned once in passing, 3 months earlier, when they had driven by a building downtown that was being renovated, and she had said she wondered what it had looked like originally. He had remembered. She saw that he had remembered, and it changed the way she looked at him for the rest of the evening. They ate at the dining room table, which DeShawn brought out for occasions. After dinner, Ashley sat with Claudette on the back porch in the cool April air, while DeShawn washed the dishes and Marcus and Imani sat at the kitchen table with coffee, the way they had settled into doing on Sundays and now, apparently, on birthdays. Imani said quietly, not quite loud enough for the back porch, "She's a good kid." Marcus said, "Yeah. Not seems like a good kid. Not could be a good kid. Just, yeah." Imani had been waiting, without knowing she was waiting, for that particular yeah, for a long time. She didn't say anything else about it. She picked up her coffee cup. Ashley did not say a word to DeShawn about the note in the bear, not that day, not that month, not in the year that followed. She continued to do exactly what she had been doing: homework at the kitchen table, dishes after dinner, the Sunday lunches, Priya on video call twice a week, the bear on the pillow. But she also started bringing home different books from the school library. Not textbooks, not novels, books about how the child welfare system worked, about public record access, about how county government was organized. She read them at her desk after DeShawn had turned off the living room light and gone upstairs, by the small lamp, with a composition notebook open beside her. She wrote things down in handwriting that had gotten neater over the years. Making notes she reviewed and added to and organized with the same methodical care she applied to everything else. She knew what she was looking for. The note inside the bear had a name on it. A specific name, written in specific handwriting, with a specific sentence beneath it. She needed to understand what that name meant, needed to understand how that person had known enough about DeShawn Williams to trust him with a child and one sentence. She needed to understand the logic of what had been done, because she was old enough now to understand that it required logic. You don't prepare the way the person who wrote that note had prepared without having a reason. By 9th grade, she was first in her class in every subject except gym, where she was second. By 10th grade, she was first in her year. Her teachers wrote different things about her in those years: focused, analytical, asks questions that go beyond the assignment, demonstrates unusual capacity for sustained attention. DeShawn kept those reports too, in the same drawer as the elementary school ones, a growing record of someone becoming more fully themselves. She found the first real piece of information in 11th grade. Not a name, not an address. A 7-sentence article from a local Charlotte paper, archived online, from a year before she was born. Enderley Park electrician rescues neighbor's child from storm-damaged tree. She read it 3 times. A man named DeShawn Earl Williams, 56 years old, had climbed an oak tree in his neighbor's backyard during a severe thunderstorm to retrieve a 6-year-old boy who had gotten stuck on a broken branch and couldn't get down. He had done this before the fire truck arrived. He had declined to be interviewed. The article was 7 sentences long, and the 7th sentence said the boy was uninjured. She sat at her desk with her laptop open to that article for a long time. Then she understood something that she had been circling around for 2 years without quite reaching. The person who had written the note hadn't chosen a road at random. They had chosen his road, specifically, because they had known through time, through observation, through whatever process had generated that specific and confident knowledge that DeShawn Williams was the kind of man who would stop. Not might stop, would. She closed the laptop. She looked at the bear on the pillow across the room. She thought about the stitching on the back seam, the older stitches, and then, newer, the stitches that were not hers. She had understood for a long time that the note had been placed there before she knew about it. She had understood that someone had opened the bear and closed it again with more care than the original construction. She now understood that this had been done by the same person who had understood, accurately, that DeShawn Williams was the right person to find her on that road. She got up, turned off the lamp, and went to bed. In the fall of her junior year, she noticed that DeShawn's left stride was starting to come up short. It was subtle. She wouldn't have noticed if she hadn't spent 9 years walking beside him on Sunday mornings when he took his long walk around the neighborhood, but it was there, a slight shortening of the left step, the kind of thing that starts in the knee or the hip and works its way out over time. He didn't mention it. She didn't ask. But she started setting the coffee maker the night before so it would be ready when he came downstairs. She started making breakfast on the mornings she was home, nothing elaborate, eggs and toast or oatmeal, and having it on the table by 5:50. She did these things without announcement or explanation. The way he had done things for 9 years without announcement or explanation, and he accepted them in the same spirit without making it a conversation, without making it a moment. They had built, over 9 years, a way of being together that was mostly nonverbal and almost entirely functional, and which both of them would have been unable to describe in any satisfying way to someone who asked about it. One evening in November, she was at the sink finishing the dishes when she heard the sound of a piece of paper being set on the kitchen table. She knew the sound of the table had spent years at it, and she knew the particular sound of paper touching its surface. She finished the dish she was holding, rinsed it, dried it with the towel from the oven handle, and set it in the cabinet. Then she turned around. There was a piece of paper on the table with a college logo in the upper left corner. A scholarship program, full tuition, room and board, renewable for 4 years, for high-achieving students from under-resourced backgrounds. Deadline January 31st. DeShawn was at the window looking out at the oak tree, which was bare now, the branches visible against the November sky. He said, without turning around, "She would have wanted you to know about this place." Ashley didn't ask who he meant. She had known for a long time who the she in that sentence was. She picked up the paper and read it twice. Then she set it on the table and went upstairs to her room and took out her composition notebook and began to write down what she would need to put together for the application. She got in. Full scholarship, 4 years, room and board included. The letter came on a Tuesday in March, and she read it twice, standing at the mailbox, then went inside and set it on the kitchen table where she had found the scholarship information 4 months before. DeShawn came home from the church at 6:15 and saw it. He picked it up. Read it again, folded it in thirds the way he folded important documents, set it back on the table. Then he stood up and went out the back door. She watched him from the kitchen window. He stood in the backyard looking up at the oak tree for a long time, one hand resting flat against the trunk. He wasn't moving, wasn't doing anything visible. She understood, without needing to analyze it, that he was having a moment that was his and not hers to interrupt. She went back to making dinner. That August, a week before she was scheduled to leave, Marcus and Imani came for what felt like both a regular dinner and something else that didn't have a name. Imani brought a cake with no writing on it, just cake, just chocolate, which had become the default because Ashley had said once that she liked chocolate, and that had been enough for Imani. Marcus brought a small desk lamp for the dorm room and said, with a certainty that suggested he had researched this, that dorm rooms were never well lit enough. All 4 of them ate at the dining room table. It was the 5th or 6th time in 9 years that they had all been at that table at the same time, and the ease of it, the way they passed dishes, and moved around each other in the kitchen and sat down without choreography, was itself a kind of record of what had accumulated over those years. Near the end of the meal, while Marcus was refilling his water glass, Ashley said, "I want to ask you something." She said it to DeShawn, not to the table, to him specifically. Marcus set down the pitcher. Imani put her fork on her plate. Ashley said, "The night you found me, you were walking home on that road. Had you always walked that road?" 9 years, he said. "Every evening." "Did you ever run into anyone you knew on that road?" He looked at her steadily. He read the real question inside the question she had asked, the specific, directional question beneath the general one, and he made a decision in the span of a few seconds that he had been preparing for, in some part of himself, for 5 years. He said, "There was a woman. She worked for the county social services, the Enderley Park area. She walked that road sometimes when she was heading home. We'd talk for a minute or two when we crossed paths. This would have been maybe 3, 4 years before I found you." She knew the area well, Ashley said. She knew it well. It was her job to know it. She knew the families in that neighborhood, the kids who were doing well and the ones who weren't. She used to talk about the ones she worried about. The dining room was very quiet. Outside, a car went by on Crestdale Avenue. Ashley looked down at her plate. Then she said, her voice level and careful, "Where is she now?" He waited a moment before he answered. "She moved away," he said. "A few years back." That was all he said. No elaboration, no explanation. No one asked for more. But Ashley heard something in the way he said it. A weight in the phrase moved away that wasn't the weight of forgetting. It was the weight of someone who knows where a thing has gone and has chosen, for a reason, not to say so yet. She didn't ask anything else, not yet. The night before she left, she sat on the floor of her bedroom with her back against the bed frame and the bear in her lap. The room was mostly packed boxes by the door, the suitcase zipped. The quilt was still on the bed. She had asked whether she could take it, and DeShawn had said of course. It was packed in one of the boxes. She thought about the note. She had read it once, 5 years ago, and sewn it back immediately, and she had not opened it again. She didn't need to. She remembered every word. She had turned those words over in her mind at various intervals over 5 years on the school bus, in the library, in the particular quiet of the house after DeShawn went to bed, and she had, by now, a fairly complete picture of what the words meant and who must have written them and what that writing must have cost. There was still the question of why. She had the shape of it. She didn't have all of it. She put the bear into her suitcase, not into the storage box she was shipping separately, not left on the pillow for some future use. She was taking it with her, the way she had taken it every place she had been in her life. She went downstairs. DeShawn was in his usual chair with the living room light on, not watching television, just sitting in the way he sat, sometimes in the evenings when the day was done, and there was nothing left to do. She sat in the chair across from him. They sat like that for a while, quiet, the house around them making its nighttime sounds, the oak tree moving in the wind outside. Then she stood up and turned off the living room light. This time it was her. They went upstairs together for the last time in this house, in this configuration, in this particular arrangement of two people who had become something to each other over 9 years without ever finding the right word for it. At the top of the stairs he paused, the pause she had heard 9 years of, every night, the brief stop at the top of the staircase that she had never asked about. This time she stopped beside him. They stood in the dark at the top of the stairs, the night light making its orange stripe on the floor. She asked, "Why do you always stop here?" He said, "Listening to make sure you were asleep." She looked at him. He looked at her. The house was quiet around them. Then she went to her room and he went to his, and both doors closed. In the morning, he came downstairs at 5:40 and found the coffee already made and 2 mugs on the table, the green one that was his, and the yellow one that had been in the back of the cabinet for 5 years. She was sitting behind the yellow mug with her arms folded in front of her, looking at him. He stood in the kitchen doorway. He looked at the yellow mug for a long moment. He pulled out his chair and sat down and picked up the green mug. She picked up the yellow one. They drank coffee in the early light coming through the window, beside Loretta's list on the refrigerator, with its lighthouse magnet from Maine, and the first semester schedule beneath it that Ashley had printed from the university website 3 weeks ago. The suitcase was by the door, latched. The boxes were stacked beside it. The bear was in the suitcase. The note was in the bear. 2 months after Ashley left for college, DeShawn sold the house on Crestdale Avenue. He had not made this decision quickly. He had been arriving at it slowly, the way you arrive at certain decisions, not by choosing so much as by eliminating alternatives until only one remains. The house was paid off. The neighborhood was changing, Marcus and Imani were making sounds about buying a place in the suburbs, and would eventually stop making sounds about it and actually do it, and the particular gravity of Sunday lunches would shift to wherever they were and not to Crestdale Avenue. New Jerusalem Baptist had a caretaker lined up to take over from him, a younger man, 53, recently retired from the postal service, who had already been coming in on the days DeShawn was under the weather. And there was the other thing. Marcus came the evening he signed the contract. Sat at the kitchen table and looked at his father with the look of a man who has learned that some of his father's decisions will not be explained to him in advance, and has made a partial peace with this fact. "Where are you going?" he asked. "Greensboro," DeShawn said. Marcus was quiet for a moment. "Why Greensboro?" DeShawn looked at the list on the refrigerator. Loretta's handwriting on the top half, his on the bottom. He said, "I like it there." Marcus looked at him for a while. He was 44 years old, and he had his father's face, and some of his father's patience, and all of his father's habit of understanding, eventually, when a question was not going to be answered directly. "Okay," he said. "Okay?" DeShawn said. "You've earned the right to like Greensboro," Marcus said. He didn't ask anything else. DeShawn moved to Greensboro in October, 6 weeks before what would have been his and Loretta's 52nd anniversary. He rented a one-bedroom house on a quiet street with trees on both sides that dropped their leaves in November in a way that made the whole block look carpeted, and a coffee shop at the corner that opened at 6 in the morning and was run by a woman named Rosalind, who remembered his order after the third visit and had it ready when she saw him come through the door. He found a small Baptist church 3 blocks away that needed a caretaker for 4 mornings a week. He was always the first one there. The road from the church to his house took him down a side street. On that street there was a laundromat, a small place, one large window facing the sidewalk, the name on the sign in the same font it had probably been in for 30 years. The window was always bright in the mornings. Through it he could see the machines running, the folding tables along the back wall, the counter near the door, where the woman who ran the place stood doing paperwork in the early hours. He walked past it every morning on the way home. He didn't stop. He wasn't ready. He had not yet figured out exactly what he would say when he was ready, and he had learned over 75 years that showing up before you know what you're going to say is a good way to say the wrong thing. He thought about Ashley. He thought about the note. He thought about what the note must have cost to write and what the decision behind it must have cost even more. He thought about what it means to make the one decision available to you that you will have to live with forever, and to make it carefully, and to do the one thing you can do, which is to put something small and specific inside something the child will keep, so that if the person who finds her is the right kind of person, the right kind of person will have what they need. He walked past the window every morning and did not stop. Not yet. Ashley Carter came home for Christmas. 18 years old, first year of college. She took a bus 3 hours from the university down to Greensboro, and DeShawn picked her up at the station in the used Civic he'd bought after selling the truck, a sensible car for a person who no longer needed a truck bed. They had dinner at the house, just the two of them, pork chops and sweet potatoes and the collard greens that had become, over 9 years, a signature of the specific gravity of home cooking in that particular household. She slept on the sofa with a blanket from the hall closet and her knees pulled up a little to fit, the way she had slept in tight spaces as a child, efficiently, without complaint. The next morning they went for a walk. He had told her about the street, mentioned it in a phone call 2 months earlier. In the offhand way he mentioned things he actually wanted her to pay attention to. She had paid attention. She had not said so on the call. She said so now, as they turned the corner onto the block. "This is the street you told me about." "It is," he said. They walked slowly because of his left stride, which had gotten no worse over the fall but had not gotten better. She matched his pace without doing it conspicuously, which was a thing she had gotten better at over the years, the art of accommodating someone without making them feel accommodated. They walked down the block. The trees were bare in December, the branches visible against the low gray sky. The coffee shop at the far end had its light on. A woman was sweeping her front steps 2 doors down. Somewhere in the direction they were heading, a dog was making its views on the morning clear. They passed the laundromat. The window was lit. The machines inside were running. She could see the tumbling shapes through the glass, hear the faint mechanical steadiness of them. The smell of warm fabric reached them through the door, which was propped open an inch. Behind the counter, a woman stood with a clipboard, writing something down, hair pulled back from her face, light blue uniform shirt. She was maybe 40, maybe a few years older. It was hard to tell at this angle and in this light. As they passed the window, the woman looked up. It was reflex, the reflex of someone accustomed to noticing movement on the other side of the glass, to tracking the shapes that go by. Her eyes moved across DeShawn without stopping. They stopped on Ashley. 1 second, maybe 2. The woman's face did not change in any dramatic way. She did not move toward the door. She did not raise her hand or make any gesture. She didn't do anything that, if you had been watching from across the street, you would have been able to point to and describe. There was just the looking, the specific quality of it, which was not the way you look at a stranger and not the way you look at someone you know, and not exactly the way you look at anything you have a name for. It was the way you look at something you have been carrying inside yourself for a very long time and are now, for the first time, seeing exist outside of you on a sidewalk, in an ordinary gray December morning, walking slowly beside an old man, taller than you imagined, real in the way that things are real when you are finally allowed to see them. Then she looked back down at her clipboard. DeShawn didn't stop walking. He kept his pace steady, unhurried, and he did not turn his head back. But Ashley saw. She saw the looking, and she saw the looking away, and she saw the way DeShawn did not stop and did not turn around, and she understood that he had known this moment was possible and had decided, at some point, to let it come to its own shape without forcing it. She didn't say anything. They walked to the coffee shop at the corner and went inside and ordered his coffee the usual way, hers with an extra shot because the semester had trained her into needing it, and they sat at the table near the window, the one that looked back down the block in the direction they had come from. She wrapped both hands around her cup. He looked out the window. The block was quiet. The woman who had been sweeping her steps was gone. The dog had stopped making its views known. The morning had settled into itself the way December mornings do, low light, still air, the kind of quiet that is not empty but full of things that have already been said. She looked at the side of his face. He was looking at the block, at some specific point on it that she could calculate, if she needed to, by following the angle of his gaze. She didn't need to. She looked back down at her coffee. Neither of them said anything for a long time. The coffee shop moved around them, Rosalind behind the counter, the hiss of the machine, 2 other customers in the back corner with laptops, the ordinary sounds of an ordinary morning. After a while she said, "You like it here." "I do," he said. "The church is good?" "The church is good." She nodded. She turned the cup in her hands. Then she said, "She's still there." He looked at her. She was looking at her cup. He said, "Yes." She nodded again, slowly, the way you nod when you have confirmed something you suspected and are now deciding what to do with the confirmation. Neither of them said anything else about it. She asked whether he wanted another coffee. He said he was all right. She went up and got one for herself anyway, and came back and sat down, and they stayed there another half hour, talking about her coursework and the city, and what Marcus and Imani were doing for the holidays, and outside the window the block stayed quiet, and the laundromat window stayed lit, and the morning went on in its ordinary December way. When they left, they walked back the same way they had come. They passed the laundromat again. The window was still bright. Inside, the woman was at the folding table now, working through a stack of linens with the practiced efficiency of someone who has done this thousands of times and finds a certain steadiness in the repetition. She didn't look up this time. DeShawn walked past. Ashley walked beside him, matching his pace, their footsteps quiet on the cold sidewalk. At the corner she stopped. He stopped beside her. She looked back at the laundromat for a moment, at the lit window, at the woman inside, moving with purpose through her morning, at the small, ordinary fact of a life being lived in a place that another person had carried across a long distance without knowing whether the distance could ever be closed. Then she turned and walked with him toward home. The bear was in her suitcase back at the house. The note was inside it, where it had been for as long as she could remember and where it would stay, folded along its old creases, held closed by 2 sets of stitches, his and hers, for whatever came next. Whatever that was. Whenever she was ready. She went back to school in January, and he went back to his mornings at the church and his afternoons in the small house on the tree-lined street and his evenings with the news and whatever book he was working through, which lately had been a history of the American labor movement that Marcus had given him for Christmas and which he was reading slowly, a chapter at a time, the way he read everything, not rushing toward the ending but moving through it deliberately, paying attention to the parts that other readers might have skimmed. He thought about what Ashley had said at the coffee shop. "She's still there," said quietly, without accusation, without the particular weight that the sentence could have carried. Just a statement of fact, offered in the tone of someone who has done the work of arriving at a fact and is now reporting it. He thought about what it had taken her to arrive at that fact. He thought about the library books, which he had noticed over the years, the different kinds of books she brought home from middle school and high school, the composition notebooks she filled with handwriting he had never looked at directly but had noticed being filled. He thought about the question she had asked at the August dinner. "Did you ever run into anyone you knew on that road?" He had understood, when she asked it, that she was not asking about the road. He had understood that she had been working toward that question for a long time and had finally arrived at the place where she could ask it. He had given her what he could give her. The rest she would have to come to in her own time, in her own way, at the speed that was right for her. He had learned, in 75 years, that this was the only speed that mattered. In February, she called on a Sunday evening and they talked for an hour about ordinary things, her classes, the weather in both cities, whether he had been to the coffee shop lately. At the end of the call she said, "I've been thinking about coming back in the spring. Maybe March." He said that sounded good. She said, "I'd want to walk that street again." He said that was fine. The street was there. She said okay, and they said goodnight, and he sat in his chair with the phone on the side table and the book closed in his lap, and the evenings settling around the house, and he thought about a child of 8 years old lying on a wet road with a bear pressed against her chest, and about the 9 years of mornings and evenings between then and now, and about all the things that had been built in those years, built without a plan, without a blueprint, without any particular system except the one his father had demonstrated on a dark Alabama road 66 years ago, which was simply the system of doing the thing that was in front of you to do, as well as you could do it, without expecting anything in return. He opened his book. He read for another hour before going to bed. In March she came back as she had said she would. She took the same bus, he picked her up at the same station. They had dinner this time. She cooked pot of chicken soup from a recipe she had gotten from Claudette years ago and had been making in the college dormitory kitchen on Sunday evenings when she needed something that tasted like a specific kind of home. It was good. He told her so. She said she knew it needed more pepper, but she hadn't had any. He got the pepper from the cabinet and put it on the table. That night, she stayed up later than he did, sitting at the kitchen table with her laptop open. He went to bed at 9:30 and passed the kitchen on his way, and she was typing something, or reading something he couldn't tell which, from the doorway. He said goodnight. She said goodnight without looking up, which was a habit she had developed over 4 months of college, and which meant she was working through something and not ready to surface from it yet. He understood this. He went to bed. In the morning she was up before him. The coffee was made. 2 mugs on the table, both of them used this time. After breakfast she said, "Can we walk?" They walked the same route they had walked in December. Same pace, same direction, same unhurried approach to the block. The trees had leaves now, early March, just coming in, pale green against a sky that couldn't decide between winter and spring. The coffee shop had put 2 chairs outside on the sidewalk for the first time since fall. They walked past the laundromat. The window was bright. The machines running. The same smell of warm fabric and detergent through the propped open door. This time Ashley stopped. She stood on the sidewalk and looked through the window. DeShawn stopped beside her. The woman behind the counter was helping a customer, an older man, with a canvas bag, picking up what looked like dry cleaning. The woman was efficient and pleasant, handing over the items one at a time, marking something on her clipboard, making change from the register. Ashley watched this for a moment. Then she said, still looking through the window, "What was she like when you talked to her on the road?" DeShawn was quiet for a moment. "She was direct," he said. "Said what she meant, didn't talk more than she needed to." Ashley nodded slightly. "Did she talk about her family?" "No." Another pause. Inside the laundromat, the customer took his bag and left. The woman at the counter made a note on her clipboard. "Did she know about me?" Ashley asked. "When she talked to you, Did she ever say anything about a specific child she was worried about? He took his time with this one. No, he said. She talked about the work in general. The neighborhood. The families she was trying to keep track of. Ashley was quiet. She looked at the woman behind the counter for a moment longer. Then she said, "But she knew who you were. She knew you were the kind of person who would stop." "I believe so," DeShawn said. Ashley nodded again. She looked at the sidewalk for a moment. Then she looked back up at the window. The woman at the counter had looked up because there were two people standing, still on the sidewalk outside her window, and stillness, on a sidewalk, is the kind of thing that draws the eye. Her gaze moved across them both. She registered DeShawn without particular reaction. Her eyes moved to Ashley. This time, the looking was different, not longer about the same duration, but the quality of it was different from December. In December there had been something held tight in it, something contained. This time, there was a loosening. Just slight. Just at the edges, the way a person looks when something they have been bracing for arrives and turns out to be different from what they had imagined bracing for. She looked back down at her clipboard. Ashley stood on the sidewalk for another moment. Then she said, "Okay." "Okay?" DeShawn said. "I just needed to see her again." He didn't ask what she meant by again because he understood exactly what she meant, and because some things don't need to be examined in the moment that they're said. They walked to the coffee shop and ordered and sat at the same table as before, near the window. The March morning was thin and bright. Outside, the two chairs on the sidewalk caught the light. After a while Ashley said, "I'm not ready to talk to her." "You don't have to be," he said. "I might not ever be," she said. "Ready, I mean. I don't know how you get ready for something like that." "No," he said. "I don't think there's a way to get ready for it. I think you just get to a point where not doing it costs more than doing it." She turned her cup in her hands. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the table. Then she said, "How long have you known where she was?" He said, "Since you were 9 years old." She was still for a moment. Then she said, "And you moved here?" "I moved here," he said. She looked at him, looked at the side of his face, which was the angle she had looked at him from for most of her life, the angle of a person walking beside someone rather than facing them. He looked back at her, and what was in his face was not apology, and was not explanation, and was not the particular look of someone who needs to be understood. It was simply what it was. The face of a man who had made a decision and was not ashamed of it. She said, "You were going to let me find it." "I was going to let you find it when you found it," he said. "If you found it." She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, very quietly, "I found it." "I know," he said. Outside, the March morning went about its business. A woman walked a dog past the window. A car parallel parked with more effort than should have been necessary. The two chairs on the sidewalk of the coffee shop sat in the early light, empty, patient. She picked up her cup. He picked up his. They sat there until the coffee was gone, and then they walked back to the house, past the laundromat with its lit window and its running machines, and she looked at it once as they went by, not long, not with any particular visible emotion, just looked at it the way you look at something you are beginning to know how to carry. The bear was in her suitcase in the small bedroom of the small house. The note was inside it, folded the way it had always been folded, held by the two sets of stitches, his and hers, waiting, the way some things wait, without urgency, for whatever was going to happen next. She went back to school 2 days later. He drove her to the station in the Civic, the same way he had in December, and she got out with her suitcase and her backpack, and turned and looked at him through the passenger window, the way she always had, not a long look, not a dramatic one, just the particular look of a person confirming that the person they are leaving is going to be all right. He gave her the look back. It meant the same thing in the other direction. She went through the station doors. He drove back through Greensboro, down the familiar streets, past the coffee shop, and the church and the bare maple tree on the corner of his block that was just beginning to show buds. He parked the car and went inside, and made a second cup of coffee, which was something he almost never did, because he had learned that 1 cup in the morning was sufficient, and a second one made the afternoon feel unsteady. He made it anyway. He sat at the kitchen table with it and looked at the wall where the refrigerator would have been if he'd had the same refrigerator as the old house, which he did not. He had bought a smaller one for this house, without the lighthouse magnet, without the list. He had packed the list when he moved. It was in the drawer of the bedside table in his bedroom, folded in thirds. Loretta's handwriting on the top, his on the bottom. He had not added to it since he moved to Greensboro, because it had occurred to him sometime in the fall, on a morning walk past the coffee shop and the laundromat and the church, that Greensboro was not a detour from whatever came next. It was where whatever came next was happening. Not everything you needed to do was on the list. He finished his coffee. He rinsed the cup and put it in the rack. He got his jacket from the hook by the door and put it on. He went out. He walked down the street in the direction of the church, past the budding maple tree, past the coffee shop where Rosalind was visible through the window wiping down the counter for the mid-morning lull. He walked past the church, which was locked at this hour, and turned and walked back. He walked slowly because of his left stride. He walked slowly because there was no reason to walk fast. He passed the laundromat on the way back. The door was propped open. The machines were running. The smell of clean warm fabric in the cool March air. He walked past it. Then he stopped. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment, looking at the propped open door. The light inside was warm and steady. Through the window he could see the counter, the register, the folding tables along the back wall. He could not see the woman from this angle. He thought about a dark road on an October evening and a child with a bear pressed against her chest. He thought about a piece of paper folded into a seam and the name on it, and the sentence beneath the name, and what that sentence had cost to write, and what the decision behind it had cost even more. He thought about 9 years of mornings and lunches and Sunday walks, and a yellow mug in the back of a cabinet, and a list on a refrigerator, and all the ordinary accumulated weight of one life coming gradually into contact with another. He thought about what Ashley had said. "I'm not ready to talk to her." I don't know how you get ready for something like that. He thought about what he had said back. I think you just get to a point where not doing it costs more than doing it. He had been thinking about it for a long time, too. He turned toward the door. He went in. The bell above the door made a small sound. The woman at the counter looked up from her clipboard. She was 41 years old, and she had worked in this laundromat for 4 years, and before that she had done other things in other places, and she was not, in the way that some people are not, someone whose face gave much away. She looked at him. He said, "Good morning." She said, "Good morning." He said, "My name is DeShawn Williams. I live on Alderman Street, 3 blocks over. I've been walking past here most mornings since October." She held her clipboard and looked at him. Something moved through her expression, controlled, brief, barely there. He said, "I think you might know who I am." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I know who you are." He nodded. He put his hands in his jacket pockets. He said, "She's good. She's in college. She's going to be fine." The woman behind the counter said nothing for a long moment. She set her clipboard down on the counter. She looked at the surface of the counter. Then she looked back up at him. She said, "I know." Her voice was even. "I've seen her, twice." "She's seen you too," he said. She nodded once. She looked at the counter again. He said, "I'm not here to make a case for anything. I'm not here to tell you what should or shouldn't happen. That's not mine to say." He paused. "I just thought you should know she's all right, from someone who's been there." She was quiet for a long time. The machines ran behind her. The morning light came through the window and lay in a stripe across the floor between them. Then she said, "Thank you." 2 words, said straight, without decoration, the way someone says thank you when what they are thanking a person for is something they didn't know they needed until it arrived. He nodded. He went back out through the door. The bell made its small sound again. He walked back down the sidewalk in the March morning, past the coffee shop and the maple tree and the church, toward the small house on the tree-lined street, where the second coffee cup was still in the dish rack, drying. Behind him, in the laundromat, the machines ran on. The light in the window was steady. It stayed on,